that song reminds us how close Christmas is getting, and I think maybe that means the third Sunday in Advent already. We got 3 candles lit up here, one more, and then after that it's Christmas. So I think it might be time for my semi-annual Christmas shopping survey. What I want to know is, anyone done? Who's done with all their Christmas shopping? Okay, now here's the one that's going to separate the overachievers, though. How many have everything wrapped, shopping done, everything wrapped, ready to go? One, there's always one, 2, 3. Okay, very good. Very good. But what I really want to know, is who hasn't started yet? That's what I want to see. Right? Hey, what's the hurry? You got 9 whole days, right? I mean, gosh. My best friend growing up came from a family of 10 kids, and he always waited until Christmas Eve to do his shopping, because you figure, Walgreens is always open on Christmas Eve at least, and you can get lots of good stuff there. But anyone else like to live dangerously that way, Christmas Eve, for their shopping? It seems that there's always someone. It seems like it's usually a guy who considers it to be his personal challenge, like his private Mount Everest. Is this thing?
Yeah,
it's going in and out. Actually, it sounds like it's buried in an old guy's beard, doesn't it? How's that? Okay. All right. So anyway, you still got 9 days. Don't sweat it. All is well. A couple of weeks ago I talked about how different people have all sorts of different reasons for celebrating the season, and there's no getting around the fact, though, that the main reason that we have this holiday here in the United States, at least, is because of a story that we find in the Gospel of Luke. Now, those of us who are Charlie Brown fans, anybody look forward to a Charlie Brown Christmas coming around every year? It's going to be on Tuesday this year, I'm told. You remember the scene, the famous scene in the show. Charlie Brown wants to know the true meaning of Christmas. And it was finally Linus, the precocious blanket-clutching child, who tells everyone what the true meaning of Christmas is. Now, we're going to watch the scene here in just a little bit. And apparently Linus only had a King James version of the Bible at home. But you know what? In this case, that old King James English works very well in telling this story. So let's sit back and listen to Linus.
I guess I really don't know what Christmas is all about. Isn't there anyone who knows what Christmas is all about?
Sure, Charlie Brown. I can tell you what Christmas is all about. Lights, please. And there were in the same country shepherds, abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them. And the glory of the Lord shone round about them. And they were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, Fear not. For behold, I bring you tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you. Ye shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host praising God, and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. That's what Christmas is all about, Charlie Brown.
Now that's what you call classic stuff, isn't it? And that indeed is what Christmas is all about. Ooh. I'm going to turn this off. I brought this up just in case that kept on happening. For some reason it's feeding back. So if you were a Jewish person back in those days when Linus is describing the angels bringing this good news, if you were a Jewish person, the announcement that the Messiah had been born would have been really, really big news. Because hundreds of years before that, there were these prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, who had predicted the coming of the Messiah, and the people had been waiting ever since. This would have been huge news. So who would you expect to be the first to receive this big news? I don't know, maybe the king or the high priest and his council, but instead it's a bunch of shepherds in this story who get the big news. Now there's nothing wrong with shepherds, but they weren't exactly at the top of the socioeconomic ladder back in those days. And the only place that we find shepherds getting the good news, and Jesus being born in a manger, presumably in a stable, is in this particular gospel, Luke. In Matthew, the big news is delivered to the three wise men, who are also known as the three kings, right? Quite a contrast from shepherds. They become the first visitors instead of the shepherds. Now these guys, they're at the top of the socioeconomic ladder. And just to give you an idea of how important they must have been, the first thing that happens when they get into town is that they get a private audience with the king, King Herod, who was none too pleased to hear that this Messiah had been born. More about that later. There's no stable in Matthew either, no manger. The three wise men go to visit the child in a regular house. Two completely different stories. And the reason they're so different is because the authors of Luke and Matthew, they were writing for two different audiences. Matthew is trying to convince the Jewish people that Jesus is the Messiah that the ancient prophets had been talking about. And he was responding to some resistance to this message. So he's using imagery and symbolism that places Jesus in this exalted position, this role of authority, someone who is visited by wise men, who is feared by the king of Israel, and wouldn't be caught dead in a stable. Now Luke, on the other hand, he's writing for the non-Jewish community. His message is that Jesus is for everyone, which is true to the words of the angels in that story. Tidings of great joy for all the people, not just the Jewish people, the Israelites, not just for the wealthy and the powerful, but everyone. He isn't born like royalty. Jesus is born like a homeless person in a place that's reserved for animals. And this is a not so subtle reminder to the audience that Israel's great leaders came from humble beginnings. The nation of Israel is named after a character from the story in the book of Genesis who started out being known as Jacob. Later on, Jacob gets his name changed to Israel, and he becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Anyone know what Jacob's profession was? Remember the story of Jacob and Esau? Esau was the hunter, and Jacob was a shepherd. Interesting, right? How about King David, the greatest king of all? What was he? He started out as a shepherd, right? So you see these authors making these linkages, trying to convince people of one aspect or another. Luke is saying that Jesus is going to break down the barriers of gender and socioeconomic status that tended to divide people. That's why the shepherds are the first to hear about it. Luke and Matthew are two different stories that really cannot be reconciled. Even though people try to do it, they twist themselves into rhetorical pretzels trying to blend these two stories together. But the authors had two very different agendas, or maybe we could say they had two different perspectives. So, which perspective is the right one? They're different stories, but which one is right? How about both? How about both? Because from later accounts we can see that Jesus would spend time with people who were at both ends of the spectrum. He could hold his own, debating with the Roman governor Pilate. He had friends like Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council, and yet he also would befriend the people who were labeled as sinners in that culture. So he was more of an everyman than a common man, really. And the Gospels show that he lived very simply, not much in the way of money or possessions. Different perspectives, but one thing both stories have in common is that people were expecting something momentous, something important as a result of his birth. And not everyone was happy about the news. Back to Herod. Remember what the story says that Herod did when the wise men told him why they had come to town and who they were looking for? They referred to this child as the new king, and so of course Herod loses his mind, and he reacts with this unimaginable act of violence. See, he doesn't know exactly where this newborn child, this newborn king is, or who it is, so he gives orders to kill all the male children under a certain age. Horrible story. And by the way, nothing like that ever really happened. There's absolutely no historical record of anything like that. I mean, can you imagine a king who had successfully had all of the male children murdered in a town that size? That would have made the record books somewhere. It would have been noted by historians of the day, certainly by this guy named Josephus, who was carefully recording the events of the conflict between the Romans and the Jewish people. So what's really happening in this story is that this author again is trying to establish linkage between the New Testament story and all the way back to the Old Testament again. He's trying to establish a link between King Herod and Pharaoh back in Egypt before the Exodus, right? Pharaoh did the same thing to the Jewish male children in Egypt. When he learned that Moses had been born, he figured, I'm going to have to eradicate this guy because he's trouble. The same thing happens in that story. Pharaoh saw Moses as a threat and ordered all of the Jewish male children under a certain age to be killed, which never really happened either. More mythology. But the idea here is that you've got Jesus being compared to Moses. Jesus is being compared to Moses, but instead of leading people out of physical bondage in Egypt, like we find in those Old Testament stories, Jesus is bringing a different kind of liberation. If Moses was the old Messiah leading people out of Egypt, then Jesus was the new Messiah who was going to lead people out of the suffering and oppression that was caused by Roman imperialism and the Jewish collaborators that went along with them. At least that's what some people thought. And incidentally, in the story of Matthew, if you follow it a little bit farther along, the reason that Jesus escapes from Herod's plot is because his parents grab him, pick up, and move to Egypt. And so once again, he has to come out of Egypt. So you got these constant linkages being dangled out there, really in both stories. So people thought that Jesus was going to bring about this form of liberation, that there was going to be this liberation from suffering and oppression under the Romans. And what actually happened was that, things did not exactly get better after the birth of the Messiah. In fact, they got worse, much worse. He never succeeded in putting an end to Roman domination. In fact, 40 years or so after Jesus, the Romans got tired of dealing with all of the uprisings and the unrest in Jerusalem, and they destroyed it, leaving the Jewish people without a homeland until 1948. That's a long time. That's not exactly what anyone would call good news or tidings of great joy, like Linus was talking about when he tried to explain the meaning of Christmas. There's a good reason why he had those tidings of joy in there, because those stories were written before the Romans decided to destroy Jerusalem. A different perspective. A different perspective. Now, if we really want to know what the tidings of great joy might have been, we have to wait for the Gospel of John, which was written after Jerusalem had been destroyed. Now, John doesn't have what we would consider to be a Christmas story, or even a birth narrative per se. But here's the opening passage from the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all the people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. A lot of darkness going on back in those days. And it is a birth story in the sense that it describes something that's breaking into human consciousness. It was originally written in Greek. In the beginning was the Word, and that word, the Greek word that gets translated as that is a word called logos, which I've talked about many times before. And it means a whole lot more than just a word in the way that we commonly define it. Logos was this technical term in ancient Greek philosophy which was used to refer to what they regarded as active reason or the ordering principle pervading the universe. That's logos. It has this rich, many layers of meaning. So the author of John is writing in the aftermath of this disaster, right? Their whole world had been torn apart when Jerusalem was basically ransacked. The temple was destroyed and desecrated by the Romans. It was a disaster. And then Jesus comes along, again in the Gospel of John, and gives them a new commandment, which is pretty amazing. He gives them this new commandment. He says that I want you to love one another. That was the commandment in John. Love one another as I have loved you. Now you go back and read Matthew and Mark and Luke, and you are going to find that they are filled with all of these dramatic references to demons. There's a lake of fire for the unbelievers. There are armies of angels who are going to come along and they're going to sort things out, so to speak. The future is one of darkness and violence in those stories. There was darkness. We get to John and we hear a completely different story. No demons, no armies of angels, no lake of fire, no condemnation, no stories of darkness and suffering. Instead, the word that's used most often in John is love. Love shows up in John twice as much as any other gospel. We also find the word joy again. Something changed, and it happened in this community of people where that gospel, the Gospel of John, originated. So there was a community somewhere that had come to know and practice a different version of the life and teachings of Jesus, one that brought joy back into the picture. Jesus comes along and he says, hey, let's try something different for a change based on embodying what I like to think of as a higher order of values. So the message is that you respond to oppression in a different way. Instead of invoking revenge, retribution, you rely on principle. Practice the golden rule. Treat everyone as if they were part of your family. So how are we doing with that? I'd say we're doing better. I think we keep doing better, and there's always room for improvement. I saw this meme on Facebook the other day. I think it really gets to the heart of the matter here. Want to keep Christ in Christmas? Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, forgive the guilty, welcome the stranger and the unwanted child, care for the ill, love your enemies. But instead, it seems we keep hearing about how keeping the Christ in Christmas means putting up yet more nativity scenes and making sure that we say Merry Christmas instead of the dreaded Happy Holidays or something else like that. When we finally get it on a much larger scale what it really means to keep Christ in Christmas, when we finally get it on a much wider worldwide scale, we'll all have a better idea of what Linus was talking about when he told us about tidings of great joy for all the people. So that's a little reminder of what our mission is going forward, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.